The atmosphere was not merely cold, it was predatory. The winter wind possessed a set of icy fangs, gnawing through the landscape and sinking deep into the marrow of the earth. It howled across the flatlands, a relentless stalker that sniffed out every frayed seam in her tattered prairie gown and every thin, worn patch in the charcoal-colored scarf wrapped tightly around her skull and jaw. To Mai, the frigid air was no longer a sensation she felt. It had transformed into a physical entity, a crushing weight that conspired with the two heavy containers of coal she carried. One in each hand, they dragged her toward the permafrost, threatening to pull her shoulders from their sockets. Behind her, she bore a massive, towering crate of belongings, a grotesque collection of every scrap and relic her father had deemed too worthless to keep, yet heavy enough to serve as her final burden. The leather straps bit into the meager wool of her coat, leaving raw channels in her skin. This weight was her constant companion, a searing reminder of her status. It was a dowry comprised of fuel and discarded rags, a payment for the man willing to relieve a father of a daughter he considered a simpleton. Those parting words remained etched in her mind, as sharp and biting as the sound of a frozen pond cracking under a heavy boot. He had called her a millstone, a redundant mouth to feed that offered no profit in exchange for its existence. She crested a jagged, wind-scoured ridge and finally saw her destination. The dwelling was less of a home and more of a blemish upon the horizon, a jagged wound of dark, unpolished timber and thick sod hunkered low against the suffocating, leaden dome of the sky. It matched the bleak description in the letter perfectly. A refuge at the edge of the void, intended for a man who possessed nothing. A pathetic, thin ribbon of smoke struggled to escape the stone chimney, the solitary evidence of life amidst 1,000 miles of barren, snow-dusted wasteland. This was the end of the line. It marked the conclusion of one chapter of misery and, she assumed, the grim introduction to another. She shed no tears. Experience had taught her that salt water only froze upon the skin, offering no solace and even less warmth. Instead, she merely adjusted the crushing load on her spine, tightened her numbing grip on the coarse burlap sacks, and pressed forward. Her boots struck the brittle, icy crust of the snow in a rhythmic, lonely cadence. Before she could even reach the threshold, the door groaned open. The figure who emerged seemed to be carved from the same rugged materials as the cabin itself, all sharp angles and weathered, leathery textures. He was a man of significant height, though he appeared more compact due to his posture, a profound stillness that seemed to swallow the surrounding noise and motion. His countenance was a topographical map of a life spent under the sun and wind, and his eyes mirrored the pale, judging gray of the winter firmament, possessing an observant, quiet depth. He was dressed in utilitarian, mended denim and a flannel shirt that had been laundered into a state of extreme softness. His initial gaze fell upon the coal sacks she gripped, a brief, undecipherable spark dancing in his pupils. Then, his eyes traveled to her face before finally settling on the precarious mountain of luggage strapped to her back. He offered no greeting, he simply stood in a silence that felt as vast as the plains. Mai halted several paces from the door, her breath blooming in the frozen air like white ghosts. She extended the sacks of coal toward him, a grim offering, the final currency of her father's transaction. The man, known as Amos according to the correspondence, finally broke his statue-like pose. He moved with a surprising fluidity, his scuffed leather boots making no sound against the porch. He did not reach for the coal. Instead, he moved behind her, his large, calloused palms finding the tension in the luggage straps. With a low, guttural grunt of exertion, he unfastened the buckles and hoisted the massive weight from her weary frame. He deposited the crate beside the door with a dull, heavy thud. Only after she was unburdened did he take the coal from her hands. For a fleeting, electric second, his fingers grazed hers. The contact wasn't aggressive. It was steady and carried an unexpected, dormant heat. "Get inside," he rasped. His voice was deep and gritty, reminiscent of heavy stones grinding together at the bottom of a parched riverbed. It wasn't a gesture of hospitality, but a blunt, functional directive. The interior of the cabin was a testament to minimalism. It consisted of a single room where a modest fire flickered sullenly in a stone hearth. There was a crude table flanked by 2 chairs and a sleeping cot tucked into the shadows. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of burning pine, aged leather, and the bitter notes of coffee. While it was undeniably the home of a poor man, it was meticulously maintained. Every tool had a designated spot, the few cooking vessels near the fire were polished, and the floor had been swept clean of every speck of grit. It was the deliberate, dignified poverty of a person who cherished the few things he owned. He set the coal near the fireplace without further comment and turned to face her. With a nod, he indicated a second cot, a simple wooden frame topped with a thin mattress and a lone, neatly folded wool blanket that had seen many repairs. "That belongs to you." He stepped toward the hearth, feeding a few slivers of kindling to the embers. The fire responded, its tongues of light dancing across the walls, making the cramped quarters feel simultaneously more expansive and more claustrophobic. Mai remained by the entrance, paralyzed by uncertainty. She had been delivered like a piece of freight. Now that she was here, what was her function? She tracked his movements, noting how every gesture was efficient and purposeful. He didn't spare her another glance. He was a man shaped by isolation, and her arrival was clearly a circumstance he was tolerating rather than enjoying. Finally, her frozen limbs began to thaw, and she moved with the stiffness of a winterlocked branch. She undid the buttons of her thin coat, folded it with practiced care, and laid it at the foot of her cot. Though she was a stranger to the specific customs of this house, she was a master of the laws of survival. Make yourself useful. Make yourself invisible. Noticing the water pail near the door was nearly depleted, she reached for the handle, her eyes seeking his silent consent. He gave a microscopic, almost invisible nod, his focus remaining on the glowing coals. She stepped back out into the biting gale, the empty bucket feeling unnaturally light now that the coal and the luggage were gone. The well was 50 yards away, its iron crank glazed in a lethal layer of ice. The labor had commenced. This was her new existence, a realm of biting cold, profound silence, and the unblinking, watchful presence of Amos. The passing days fell into a cadence dictated by the rising sun and the encroaching frost. Language was discarded in favor of labor. Amos would wake before the first light, the rhythmic scrape of his boots acting as her morning bell. He would vanish for hours, checking his lines or tending to mysterious tasks beyond the ridge, always returning with the noiseless tread of a specter. In the vacuum of his absence, Mai transformed the cabin. She hauled endless gallons of water, split heavy logs into fine tinder, and mended his ragged garments with tiny, surgical stitches that served as her only form of expression. She prepared the monotonous meals of salted pork and dried beans, learning the intimate geography of his deprivation. She knew the single, hairline fracture in the ceramic mug he used for coffee. She watched him hone his blade on a whetstone until it was sharp enough to split the air. She observed the grim precision with which he rationed their shrinking stores. He never offered a word of gratitude. He never voiced a compliment. But he missed nothing. He noted how she banked the fire at night so the warmth would linger until dawn. He saw her use the gray dishwater to scrub the floorboards, ensuring not a drop was wasted. He took stock of the woodpile she built by the door, each log uniform and perfectly stacked. One afternoon, he stepped through the door to find her working with the discarded burlap from the coal sacks. She had scrubbed the grit from the fabric in the freezing well water and was now sewing it into thick patches to reinforce the threadbare curtains against the howling drafts. He paused in the doorway, watching her for a long minute. Her head was bowed in deep focus, her fingers dancing with a grace that masked how raw and chapped they were. He said nothing, but that evening, as they consumed their stew in the usual hush, he took the small portion of hard bread from his own plate and slid it toward hers. Mai stared at the bread, then lifted her gaze to his. His face remained a mask of shadows, illuminated only by the dying fire. She gave a small, matching nod and ate. It was his first offering. Their connection evolved into a series of these unspoken exchanges. He would leave a snared rabbit on the workspace, she would have it skinned, butchered, and bubbling in the pot by the time he returned from the woods. When she noticed a failing seam on his boot, she worked through the night. The next morning, he found the leather reinforced so strongly it surpassed its original make. One night, a true northern gale descended, a whiteout that shrieked like a starving predator and slammed walls of snow against their lone window. The wind pierced every microscopic gap in the logs, and the temperature inside the room plummeted. Mai shook uncontrollably, her lone blanket failing against the seeping ice. She didn't utter a word of protest. She simply dragged her cot as close to the dying fire as possible and wrapped her scarf tight. In the dead of night, she drifted awake. Not from the chill, but from a sudden, heavy warmth. Amos was standing over her. He had removed his massive, oiled canvas coat, the one he used to survive the worst of the elements, and draped it over her small frame. He was nothing but a silhouette against the dim embers. Believing her to be asleep, he lingered for a long moment, a silent guardian, before retreating to his own bed, leaving her enveloped in the heat of his protection. Tucked away among the rusted tools near the entrance was a single, exquisite axe. Its handle was crafted from smooth, perfectly balanced hickory, and its head was forged from a dark, patterned steel that seemed to absorb the light around it. It was a magnificent, deadly instrument, completely incongruent with the chipped saws and decaying implements surrounding it. This was the only item in the dwelling that did not whisper of poverty. It spoke of craftsmanship, of hidden means, and of a world far beyond this desperate struggle for breath. Occasionally, when Amos was out, Mai would let her fingers trail along the polished wood, feeling the flawless grain. It was a mystery, a piece of the man that didn't align with the narrative of the destitute hermit. It suggested a reservoir of power and intent that remained coiled and waiting within him. The arrival of a stranger was a monumental event. In the crystalline silence of winter, sounds traveled for miles, and they heard the rhythmic thumping of hooves long before the rider crested the horizon. Amos, who had been meticulously oiling a steel trap, froze. He stood and moved to the window, his entire frame vibrating with a sudden, sharp tension. Mai watched his silhouette, noting the rigid set of his shoulders. Trouble had its own specific sound, and this was it. The man who eventually rode into view was a creature of vanity and expensive hides. He was mounted on a tall, powerful gelding and wore a heavy overcoat adorned with a lush beaver fur collar. He dismounted with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed the very air he breathed was his personal property. Hollister, Amos muttered, the name sounding like a heavy stone dropped into a deep well. He turned away from the glass and fixed Mai with a hard look. "Stay back." Hollister didn't wait for an invitation. He kicked the door open, filling the small cabin with his physical mass and a suffocating aura of entitlement. His eyes, narrow and filled with a restless greed, scanned the interior, dismissing the humble surroundings with a curl of his lip. Then, his gaze landed on Mai. A slow, oily grin spread across his features. "Well, now, Amos, rumors reached me that you'd acquired a new piece of livestock. I didn't expect her to be quite so exotic." He looked her over with a clinical, predatory air, as if he were evaluating the teeth of a horse at auction. Amos stepped into the center of the room, placing himself as a physical barrier between the two. His stillness was now absolute, a terrifying contrast to Hollister's twitchy energy. "State your business, Hollister." "Just a neighborly call," the man replied, his smile remaining cold. "And a business proposition. You're barely surviving on these scraps. This patch of dirt you're squatting on borders my southern grazing lands. I'm prepared to offer a reasonable sum for it, enough to send you packing to a more civilized territory." His eyes darted past Amos to Mai again. "And I'll take the girl too. I'll pay you double whatever you wasted on her, I'd wager." The insult hung in the air like a foul mist. Mai felt a freezing dread settle in her gut, more piercing than any gale. To this man, she was merely an asset to be bartered. Her father's low valuation of her soul had followed her even to this remote corner of the world. Amos didn't flinch. When he spoke, his voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "She is not a commodity for sale." Hollister erupted in a short, mocking laugh. "Don't be a fool, man. What use do you have for her in this hovel? I can provide her with a proper estate. My house has more rooms than she has fingers." "This land is mine," Amos stated, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. The words weren't a boast, they were an ironclad fact. "And you are trespassing. Get out." Hollister's face turned a bruised shade of purple. He took a menacing step forward, his hand drifting toward the sidearm holstered at his hip. "You're in no position to dictate terms, you beggar. This entire valley will eventually fall under my name. A stubborn wretch like you is merely a temporary delay." In that instant, Mai moved. It wasn't a calculated decision, but a primal reaction. She reached into the kindling box by the fire, her fingers locking around a heavy, jagged piece of split oak. It was solid, rough-textured, and real. She rose and stepped out from behind the shadow of Amos, positioning herself at his side. She held the wood low, not brandishing it like a frantic amateur, but holding it with the quiet intent of someone ready to use it. She refused to cower. She was no longer waiting for a savior. Her eyes locked onto Hollister's, and for the first time in her life, she did not lower her gaze. Her resolve was as unyielding as the man standing beside her. The smug confidence on Hollister's face evaporated. He looked from Amos's stony, lethal expression to Mai's silent defiance and realized he wasn't looking at two victims. He was looking at a front. He saw a strength he couldn't quantify and a loyalty he didn't understand. With a hissed curse, he backed toward the exit, yanking the door open. "You'll live to regret this day," he spat, before mounting his horse and galloping away, his fury leaving a muddy trail in the pristine snow. The silence that followed his departure was thick and heavy. Amos stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the retreating figure and the scars the horse had left on his land. Eventually, he closed the door, the latch clicking home with a sound of absolute finality. He turned back into the room, his eyes finding the heavy piece of oak still gripped in Mai's white-knuckled hand. He approached her slowly. For a second, she feared he might rebuke her for overstepping. Instead, he reached out and gently pried the wood from her fingers, returning it to the kindling box. He looked at her, and the impenetrable fortress of his stoicism seemed to fracture. A new light flickered in his eyes, not quite warmth, but a deep, profound sense of respect. He had tested her with the elements, and she had endured. Hollister had tested them both with malice, and she had fought. He gave her a single, deliberate nod. It was more meaningful than any poem. The trial was over. The following morning arrived with a brilliant clarity, the world appearing scrubbed clean by the previous night's tension. The sky was a sharp, vivid azure. After they finished their silent meal, Amos stood and donned his heavy coat. He looked directly at her. "Come with me." It wasn't an order to perform a chore, it was an invitation. Mai put on her thin coat, wrapped her scarf around her head, and followed him into the blinding radiance of the new snow. He didn't lead her toward the traps or the well. Instead, he headed away from the cabin, marching toward the high, windswept ridge that served as the western boundary of their small valley. The ascent was grueling, the snow reaching their knees in places. Amos carved the path, his powerful legs moving with a tireless rhythm. He never paused to check if she was keeping pace, he simply knew she was there. They reached the crest just as the morning sun broke over the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, drenching the world in liquid gold. Mai gasped, her lungs burning from the exertion and the thin, biting air. Amos stood at the precipice, staring out at the horizon. He waited for her to join him at the edge. This was the revelation. She stepped up beside him, and her breath caught. Below them, unfolding as far as the eye could possibly reach, was not a continuation of the desolate plains, but a massive, hidden sanctuary. A wide river, a ribbon of dark, churning water, snaked through the valley floor, its banks lined with ancient cottonwoods that stood like guardians against the white. And scattered across that vast expanse, grazing quietly in the winter light, were cattle. There weren't dozens, or even hundreds. There were thousands. They appeared as tiny obsidian specks against the snow, a sprawling monument to an immense, secret fortune. Tucked into a protective bend of the river was a massive ranch house, constructed of dark, sturdy timber and river stone. Corrals and outbuildings fanned out from the main structure like a small, private city. Bold plumes of smoke rose from several chimneys, drifting confidently into the blue sky. Mai stared, her voice trapped in her throat. Her mind reeled as she tried to reconcile the image of the man beside her, the man of the mended shirt and the chipped cup, with the sheer scale of the wealth below. It seemed impossible. He sensed her confusion, his expression as unreadable as a mountain face. "My father laid the foundations of that house," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the stillness. "My grandfather was the first to claim this valley. Hollister thinks his land is the limit. He believes this is all wasteland. He has no idea what lies behind this ridge." He turned away from the valley to look at her. "The cabin, it's just a line shack. A place for the winter watch. It's quiet there. It's a place where you can truly see the character of a person, when they believe you have nothing to offer them but hard work in a cold room." He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was providing the truth. He had received her father's letter. That spiteful, cruel note intended to discard a daughter he found worthless. But Amos hadn't seen a burden, he had seen an opportunity. He wanted to find someone who wasn't blinded by gold because they didn't even know it was there. He had constructed a perimeter of poverty around himself to shield the heart of his world, and he had invited her in to see if she would succumb to the hardship or become the foundation he needed. She understood it all now. The grueling labor, the heavy silence, the constant observation, it hadn't been an act of cruelty. It had been a question. And every one of her responses, the meticulously mended clothes, the shared bread, the defiant stance against Hollister, had been her answer. She looked from the sprawling empire below, a kingdom hidden in plain sight, back to his rugged, weathered face. The wind on the ridge was sharp, but for the first time since she had arrived in this territory, she didn't feel the cold. A different sensation was blooming within her, a deep, steady heat that had no relation to a fireplace. He watched her, waiting. He had unveiled his secret life to her. Now, the path forward was hers to choose. She looked once more at the valley, a place of staggering beauty and power. Then she looked back at him, a man of staggering silence and integrity. She knew which one held the true value. She gave him a single, slow nod, mirroring the gesture he had given her the day before. It was the only confirmation he required. The descent into the valley felt like entering a different realm. The air became stiller, the sun felt more substantial. With every step, the true magnitude of the operation became clearer, the reinforced fences, the healthy, well-fed herds, the sheer permanence of the main estate. It wasn't a place of gaudy display, but of quiet, enduring strength. The interior of the great house was an extension of the man. Simple, powerful, and built to withstand time. There were polished hardwood floors, deep leather chairs softened by generations of use, and a massive hearth where a fire roared with a welcoming ferocity. It was a home, in every sense of the word. He led her into the great room, the soul of the house. He unshouldered the small pack he always carried, the one that held his meager dried rations when he stayed at the shack. From it, he produced the single, cracked ceramic cup. He walked to the grand fireplace, its mantel formed from a single, massive beam of polished oak, and placed the humble cup in the center. It sat there, a small, defiant piece of their shared history, a permanent reminder of the ridge and the lessons learned there. He turned to face her. The golden light of the fire softened the harsh lines of his face. For the first time, he lowered his internal walls entirely, and she saw in his eyes more than just respect. She saw a profound, quiet devotion. "My name is Amos Kane," he said with a formal gravity, as if they were being introduced for the first time. "This is my home." He paused, the air between them thick with the weight of everything they had left unsaid. "It is your home, as well. If you choose to stay." It wasn't a business arrangement, a plea for charity, or a transaction of convenience. It was an invitation to belong. He wasn't just offering her his wealth, he was offering her his life. He was asking her to be the second pillar of his world. Mai looked at the man, then at the cracked cup on the mantel, and finally at the fire burning with a steady, unbreakable heat. She slowly reached up and unfastened the gray scarf from her head, the fabric she had worn as a shield against the cold and the bitterness of her former life. She folded it with steady, graceful hands and placed it on the table. It was her final, silent answer. A quiet acceptance of her place. She was finally home.